The city hums outside my window, a low and constant thrum of life that never sleeps. Rain slicks the glass, blurring the million lights below into a watercolor wash of neon and gold. It's a clean sound, the rain, a simple, honest thing. Here, in this steel and glass tower, 80 stories above the pavement, everything is clean. The air is filtered, the lines are sharp, and the past is supposed to be a ghost you can lock out. But ghosts don't mind locks. They are born of them. My name is Amelia, and I am an old woman now. My hands are thin, the skin a delicate parchment over a lattice of bone and blue veins. They tremble sometimes, a testament to the weight they once carried. People who see me see a survivor, a quiet matriarch who built a small empire from nothing. They see the crisp, modern apartment, the art on the walls, the quiet dignity. They don't see the cellar. They never see the cellar. But I see it. I feel its chill in my bones, even with the thermostat set to a comfortable 72. To understand the harvest, you must first understand the planting. And my story was planted long ago, in the black, fertile soil of Havenwood, Vermont. Havenwood. Even the name was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of poetry to mask a cage. It wasn't a haven, and the woods were not a sanctuary. They were walls. The town was nestled in a valley, hugged on all sides by the Green Mountains, which stood like silent, solemn jailers. There was one road in and one road out, a fact that seemed quaint to the occasional tourist, but felt like a law of physics to those of us born there. We were a world unto ourselves, a terrarium of piety and secrets. And at the center of that world was my father, Joseph Blackwood. I remember him best on the porch of our farmhouse. It was a wide, wraparound porch, its white paint perpetually peeling in the humid summers. On Sunday afternoons, when the official church service was deemed insufficient, the town would gather on our lawn. They'd bring wicker baskets of food and fold-out chairs, their faces tilted up at my father, as if he were the sun. He never stood at a pulpit. His pulpit was the top step of the porch, a worn wooden plank that creaked under his weight. He was a handsome man, charismatic in a way that felt both divine and dangerous. He had a strong jaw, eyes the color of a stormy sky, and a voice that could be a gentle brook or a clap of thunder. He never prepared his sermons. He'd simply stand there, hands in his pockets, and speak. He spoke of grace and damnation, of the purity of the soul and the insidious nature of sin. He wove stories from the Bible into the fabric of our daily lives, making ancient parables feel as immediate as a neighbor's gossip. "The devil does not come with horns and a pitchfork," he'd say, his voice rolling over the rapt crowd. "He is not a roaring lion, not here, not in a place blessed by God like Havenwood. Here, he is a whisper, a seed of doubt planted in the dark, a moment of weakness disguised as freedom. He is the secret thought, the selfish desire, the turning away from the light even for an instant." And as he spoke, his eyes would scan the crowd, but they always found me. I would be sitting on the porch swing, my feet not yet touching the floorboards, and I'd feel his gaze land on me like a physical weight. It wasn't a look of love. It was a look of assessment, of ownership. Our home was a reflection of his soul, ordered, immaculate, and utterly without warmth. My mother Sarah moved through it like a ghost, her existence a constant, silent apology. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, the lace doilies were starched and precisely placed, the family Bible was always open on the mahogany table in the hall, its pages worn thin by my father's thumb. We were to be the perfect family, an example for the entire town, a living sermon. Perfection, I learned, was not about joy. It was about the absence of error, a scuffed shoe, a dress wrinkled from play, a book left out of place. These were not simple mistakes. They were cracks in the facade. They were evidence of a wandering mind, a soul not entirely focused on God's, and by extension, my father's, will. The greatest fear in our house was not the fire and brimstone of hell he preached about from the porch. The true terror was his disappointment. It was a living thing, a cold, heavy fog that could fill a room and choke the air from your lungs. It was a silence that was louder than any shout, a stillness in his storm-blue eyes that told you that you had not just failed him, but you had failed God himself. You had personally wounded him. And in Havenwood, a wound to Joseph Blackwood was a wound to the community's very soul. I spent my childhood trying to be invisible, to be perfect. I learned to walk without making a sound, to speak only when spoken to anticipate my father's needs before he knew them himself. I learned to keep my thoughts, my dreams, my very self, locked away in a tiny secret room in my mind. The world he had built for me was a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating. He called it love. He called it protection. He called it paradise. But even a child knows the difference between a home and a pristine, well-kept prison. And every day, I felt the bars press a little tighter. The summer I turned 16 was thick and heavy, the air buzzing with the sound of cicadas and unspoken things. It was a season of change. My body was changing, morphing into something unfamiliar, and with it came a restlessness I couldn't name. I started to see the bars of my cage with a new, painful clarity. I saw the other girls in town, girls whose fathers weren't spiritual leaders, and I saw the way they laughed. It was a sound I didn't know how to make, free and careless. I saw them talking to boys down by the general store, their glances quick and electric. It was a world I could only watch from a distance, like a foreign film with no subtitles. In my father's world, a glance was a preamble to a thought, and a thought was the seed of a sin. My path was already laid out. I would be a wife to a good, pious man of my father's choosing, a mother to God-fearing children, a pillar of the community my father had built. My life was not my own. It was another one of his sermons, and I was just the living text. But the whisper he always warned about, the devil's whisper, had found its way into my heart. It didn't speak of damnation or rebellion. It spoke of something far more tempting, normalcy. It whispered of a single moment that was mine and mine alone. His name was Samuel. He was not from one of the core families of my father's flock. His family lived on the outskirts of town and worked at the lumber mill. They were good people, but they were not chosen. They attended the regular church, not the impromptu gatherings on our lawn. Samuel had kind eyes and a slow, easy smile. He smelled of sawdust and sunshine, a world away from the scent of lemon polish and old paper that clung to my house. We never spoke, not really. We just exchanged glances. Across the town green, in the aisles of the store, they were fleeting, terrified on my part. But they were a connection, a tiny, fragile thread to a world outside my father's dominion. And that thread, I decided, was worth pulling. It took me a week to build the courage. I waited for a Tuesday, the one day my father went into the next town over for supplies. My mother was absorbed in her canning, the kitchen filled with the sweet smell of boiling strawberries and the hiss of pressure cookers. She was at her most distracted, lost in the rituals that gave her a semblance of purpose. I slipped out the back door, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Every rustle of leaves sounded like an accusation. The half-mile walk to the creek felt like a journey across a continent. The air was different out here, away from the house. It was alive. He was waiting, just as we'd arranged through a series of impossibly daring, whispered messages passed through a girl at school. He was sitting on a flat, sun-warmed rock by the water's edge, skipping stones across the shimmering surface. He smiled when he saw me, that slow, easy smile, and for the first time in my life, I felt like just a girl, not a symbol or a vessel or a sermon. We talked for what couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. He told me about his dream of saving up to buy an old truck, of maybe moving to Burlington after graduation. He asked me what I wanted to do. The question stunned me. No one had ever asked me that. I had no answer. The concept of want was a luxury I'd never been afforded. The air between us grew thick with things unsaid. He reached out and his fingers gently brushed against mine. The contact was like a jolt of lightning, a shock of warmth that spread up my arm and through my entire body. I didn't pull away. He leaned in, and I met him halfway. The kiss was clumsy and innocent. It was soft and brief, tasting of sunlight and the faint, sweet taste of the wild mint growing on the creek bank. It was nothing. It was everything. It was a single stolen moment of pure, unadulterated life, a breath of fresh air in a suffocating room. And then the air went cold. I felt it before I saw him, a sudden drop in temperature, the way the light seemed to dim, the way the chirping of the crickets ceased. I pulled back from Samuel, my breath catching in my throat, and I turned. He was standing there, not 10 feet away, at the edge of the trees. My father, Joseph Blackwood. He hadn't followed me. I knew it with a sickening certainty. He didn't need to. He just knew. It was as if my sin had sent up a flare, a signal only he could see. His face was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. There was no rage, no fire. Explosive anger I could have understood. It would have been human. This was something else. This was divine judgment. His eyes were fixed on me, and in them I saw a profound and chilling sorrow, as if he were looking at a favorite vase that had been irreparably shattered. Samuel, bless his terrified heart, scrambled to his feet. He looked from my father's face to mine, his own face pale with a fear he couldn't comprehend. He stammered a word, an apology, then turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush like a spooked deer. He didn't look back. I was alone with my father. The silence stretched, thin and sharp. He didn't move. He just watched me. I wanted to speak, to explain, to beg. But my tongue was a lead weight in my mouth. Finally, he took a step forward, and another. He walked to me, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped just before me, so close I could feel the cold radiating from him. He didn't look at where Samuel had been. He didn't look at my trembling lips. He looked directly into my eyes, as if searching for the rot in my soul. He reached out and took my arm. His grip wasn't violent, but it was like steel, a cold, unyielding band of possession. My flesh recoiled from his touch. "The devil," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, "has found a door in you." That was all. He turned and began to march me back toward the house, pulling me along like a stray animal he'd caught. I stumbled after him, my feet catching on roots and stones. I started to cry, to plead. I told him it was nothing. It was just a kiss. I was sorry, so sorry. My words were meaningless, empty sounds swallowed by the menacing silence of the woods. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. It was as if I weren't there, as if he were simply dragging a contaminated object, a piece of spoiled meat, back to where it could be properly disposed of. The walk home was the longest of my life. Every crunch of a leaf under his boots was a hammer blow. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and writhe. The sun, which had been so warm and friendly by the creek, now felt like a cold, accusatory eye in the sky. I knew, with a certainty that froze my blood, that my life, the small, constrained life I had known, was over. I had opened a door, and now my father was going to lock it. The familiar white farmhouse did not look like home. As my father dragged me across the lawn, it looked like a courthouse, a place of grim, inevitable judgment. He pulled me up the porch steps, the same steps from which he delivered his sermons on grace, and the wood groaned under our feet. He didn't let go of my arm. The pressure was a constant, cold reminder of my crime. He thrust open the front door and hauled me inside. The cool, lemon-scented air of the house was a slap in the face after the humid heat outside. The pristine order of the entryway, with its polished floors and perfectly aligned portraits of our ancestors, seemed to mock my disheveled state. My mother, Sarah, was standing at the threshold of the kitchen. A dish towel was twisted in her hands, her knuckles white. Her face was a mask of practiced neutrality, but I could see the terror in her eyes. They darted from my father's stony expression to my tear-streaked face and the red marks on my arm where his fingers dug in. She opened her mouth as if to speak, a small, hopeful sound. But then she saw the look my father gave her. It was a look of pure command, a silent order to remain where she was, to bear witness and do nothing. Her mouth snapped shut. She lowered her eyes to the floor, and in that moment, she became just another piece of furniture in the room, inanimate and powerless. My last hope vanished. My father finally released my arm, shoving me toward the center of the hall. He stood before me, a towering figure of righteous fury, his shadow stretching long and dark behind him. "You have invited a corruption into this house," he began, his voice no longer the low rumble from the woods, but the resonant, commanding tone he used from the porch. It was a performance, and my mother and I were his captive audience. "You have taken the purity of your soul, a gift from God, and you have smeared it with filth. You are a vessel of sin." He paced back and forth in the narrow hall, his boots echoing on the hardwood floors. I have spent my life building a fortress here, a bastion against the wickedness of the world. I have taught you, I have guided you, I have protected you, and you, in your weakness, in your vanity, have left the gate unlocked for the enemy to walk right in. He stopped and pointed a long, accusatory finger at me. That taint, that filth, it cannot be allowed to spread. It must be contained. It must be purged. My blood ran cold. I knew what he was talking about. I had heard his sermons about cleansing and purification, about cutting off a diseased limb to save the body. I just never imagined I would be the limb. Your soul must be isolated, he declared, his eyes blazing with a terrifying certainty. It must be separated from the world, from all temptation, so that it can be made clean again in the crucible of solitude and repentance. He seized my arm again, his grip even harder this time, and began pulling me toward the back of the house, toward the door that was always kept shut. The door to the cellar. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Please, Papa, no. I'm sorry. I'll do anything." He ignored me. My mother let out a small, strangled sob from the kitchen doorway, a sound like a dying bird. I looked back at her, my eyes screaming the plea my mouth could no longer form. "Help me. Please, Mama, do something." She just stood there, wringing the dish towel, her face a wasteland of fear and resignation. She was a prisoner too, and had been for years. My father yanked open the cellar door, revealing a flight of steep, rickety wooden stairs that disappeared into a black, gaping maw. A wave of cold, musty air rushed up, carrying the smell of damp earth, mildew, and something else. Something like despair. It was the smell of a place where things went to be forgotten. He forced me forward, to the top of the stairs. "You will stay down there," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper right next to my ear. "You will pray. You will repent. You will stay there until I have burned the sin out of you. You will stay until you are clean." He gave me a hard shove, and I stumbled, catching myself on the splintery handrail before I could fall headfirst into the darkness. I scrambled down the steps, my feet finding the damp, packed earth floor at the bottom. The only light was the pale rectangle from the open doorway above. I turned and looked up, my vision blurring with tears. I saw my father's silhouette filling the frame. "Papa, please," I begged one last time, my voice small and lost in the cavernous space. He didn't answer. He just looked down at me for a long, silent moment. Then, he pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The rectangle of light vanished, plunging me into an absolute suffocating blackness. The thump of the door settling into its frame was a sound of utter finality. And then I heard it, a sound that would echo in my nightmares for the rest of my life. The unmistakable, metallic shriek of a heavy iron bolt sliding across the outside of the door, followed by the solid, definitive clank as it settled into its housing. The sound of my tomb being sealed. Silence and darkness. A darkness so complete it felt like a physical substance, pressing in on my eyes, filling my lungs. My prison sentence had begun. The days bled into one another, measured not by sun or moon, but by the subtle shifts in the damp, chilled air that seeped through the stone walls of the cellar. Time became a thick, stagnant thing, a pool of water with no current. Amelia's world had shrunk to the size of this stone-lined box, to the smell of earth and mildew, and the single, high window, a narrow slit near the ceiling that showed only a sliver of indifferent sky. It was a patch of gray that sometimes deepened to bruised purple, but it offered no warmth, no sense of the world she had lost. Her life was now governed by two events: the scraping sound of the metal bolt sliding back in the morning, and the same sound as it slid shut again. In between, her father would leave a tray on the top step, a piece of dry bread, a cup of water, sometimes a withered apple. He never came down. He spoke to her through the heavy oak door, his voice a disembodied rumble, a constant sermon on the nature of her sin and the necessity of her repentance. "The soul is a garden, Amelia," he would drone, his cadence the same one that had captivated the town from his porch. "And sin is a weed, A tenacious, choking weed. It must be pulled out by the root, no matter how deep it has grown. This darkness, this solitude, it is the good soil, where you can be tilled and cleansed. You must pray for the strength to tear the wickedness from your own heart. She stopped listening to the words. They were just sounds, vibrations in the wood that did little to warm the profound cold that had settled in her bones. She would huddle in the farthest corner, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to remember the feeling of the sun on her skin, the taste of her mother's stew, the simple, forbidden thrill of that kiss by the creek. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a memory belonging to a different girl. The girl who had lived upstairs was gone. Only this creature of the cellar remained, this thing of shadow and silence. Her only companion was the silence itself, a living entity that pressed in on her from all sides. In its depths, she heard things, the skittering of mice in the walls, the drip of water from a pipe somewhere in the darkness, the frantic, terrified beat of her own heart. She learned the cellar's geography by touch, her fingers tracing the rough texture of the stones, the smooth, cold dampness of the packed earth floor. She knew every crack, every crumbling patch of mortar. This was her kingdom now, a kingdom of rot and despair. Weeks passed, maybe 4, maybe 5. She lost count. The sliver of sky had grown paler, the air sharper. Winter was coming. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that stalked her relentlessly. Her father's sermons became more fervent, more desperate. He spoke of hellfire and damnation, of the devil finding purchase in the hearts of the young and foolish. She wondered if he was trying to convince her or himself. The food remained meager, enough to keep her alive, but not enough to stave off the gnawing hunger or the perpetual weakness that made her limbs feel like lead. One night, the silence was different, deeper. The house above was still. Her father's heavy footsteps had long since faded as he ascended to his own bed. She had finished her water and was curled under a thin, moth-eaten blanket, trying to find a position where the cold floor didn't leach every last bit of warmth from her body. She was drifting in that gray space between waking and sleeping when she heard it. It wasn't the familiar morning scrape. This was a slow, deliberate sound, the groan of old metal, the soft, oiled schlick of the heavy bolt being drawn back. Her heart seized in her chest. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Morning? No, it couldn't be. The slit of a window was pitch black. This was the dead of night. Her father never came in the night. He never came in at all. She pushed herself up, her back flat against the cold stone wall, trying to make herself smaller, to melt into the shadows. The door creaked open. A silhouette filled the frame, a hulking shape against the faint, residual light from the hallway beyond. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, and it was not her father. She knew Joseph Blackwood's shape as well as her own. She knew the slope of his shoulders, the way he held his head. This was someone else, thicker, shorter in the neck. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed through her. An intruder. It had to be. Someone had broken into their home, a monster from the outside world who had somehow, impossibly, discovered the girl locked in the cellar. A random, terrible chance. He didn't speak. The silence was absolute, save for the sound of his breathing, a low, heavy rasp. He took a step down, then another, his boots making soft, deliberate thuds on the wooden stairs. The door swung shut behind him, plunging the cellar into absolute, terrifying blackness. She was blind. She could hear him moving, a rustle of fabric, the soft scuff of a shoe on the dirt floor. He was searching for her. She held her breath, praying the darkness would swallow her whole. But the cellar was small, and he was methodical. She heard him moving closer, his breath a foul cloud in the stale air. A wave of terror so pure and potent washed over her that it left her paralyzed. She couldn't scream. Her throat was a knot of ice. His hand found her arm. The grip was like iron. She flinched, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. That was all he needed. He was strong, far stronger than she was. He overpowered her with a brutal, silent efficiency. In the pitch-black, faceless void of her prison, she was violated. It was a storm of pain and confusion, a nightmare made real. Her mind, unable to process the horror, began to fray at the edges. It was an act of grim, anonymous violence, devoid of passion or anger, performed with the detached air of a chore. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. He let her go. She collapsed onto the floor, a heap of tangled limbs and silent sobs. She heard him moving away, his heavy steps ascending the stairs. The door creaked open, then shut. And then, the sound that would echo in her nightmares for the rest of her life, the heavy, final thud of the bolt sliding back into place. Locked. He had locked the door behind him. She lay there for a long time, the cold of the earth seeping into her, her mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. An intruder. A monster who had found her, used her, and then, inexplicably, locked her back in her cage. Why? Why would a random attacker lock the door? The question nagged at the edge of her consciousness, a dissonant note in the symphony of her fear. But she pushed it away. It was too much to comprehend. Her mind, seeking refuge, clung to the simplest, most palatable explanation. It was a random act of monstrous cruelty. A ghost. A demon her father was always preaching about. It had to be, because any other explanation was simply unthinkable. The next morning, her father's footsteps were the same. The bolt scraped back with the same grating sound. The tray was placed on the top step. His sermon began, a rambling discourse on the deceptive nature of beauty. Amelia said nothing. She was a statue carved from ice, the violation a secret, cold thing coiled in her belly. She was ashamed, terrified. If she told him, what would he do? Would he believe her? Or would he call it another sin, another lie, another reason to keep her locked away forever? The fear of his cold disappointment was, somehow, still more powerful than the fear of the faceless man in the dark. So she remained silent, guarding her new terrible secret, convinced it was a singular horror, a nightmare that, God willing, would never be repeated. She was wrong. The second time the bolt slid open in the dead of night, her fragile hope that it was a one-time horror shattered like glass. The sound, once a shock, was now a harbinger, a death knell for the girl she had been. Her body remembered before her mind did, a tremor of pure animal fear running through her. She scrambled back against the far wall, the rough stone biting into her skin, as the door creaked open and another silhouette, different from the first, blocked the faint light. This one was shorter, stockier, and smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool. Like the first, he didn't speak. The ritual was the same, the silent, brutal efficiency, the departure, and the final, damning sound of the bolt sliding home. It was then that the first terrible suspicion began to curdle in her gut. The neat, desperate theory of a random intruder fell apart. Random intruders didn't have a key. They didn't lock the door behind them. They didn't come back, or send others. The nightly visits became a grotesque and horrifying sacrament. It was never the same man. She learned to distinguish them not by sight, for the darkness remained absolute, but by their other senses. There was the one who smelled of motor oil and sweat, whose hands were calloused and rough. There was another who reeked of cheap, cloying cologne, his breathing a shallow, nervous wheeze. One man chewed on something, the small, wet sounds a constant torment in the oppressive silence. They were a legion of phantoms, a rotating cast of abusers. To her, in the terrified landscape of her mind, they were not individuals. They were a single entity, a recurring nightmare she simply called the stranger. To survive, her mind built a new wall inside the stone one. She learned to dissociate. As soon as she heard the bolt, she would begin the process. She would retreat to a place deep within herself, a small, quiet room where the world outside couldn't touch her. She would focus on a single concrete memory, the feel of sunlight on her face as she sat on the porch swing, the intricate pattern of a spider web in the corner of the barn, the taste of a wild strawberry, tart and sweet. She would hold on to these images with a ferocious intensity, letting the rest of her fade away. Her body was there, in the cold, damp cellar, but herself, the essence of Amelia, was gone. She became a spectator to her own violation, watching from a great and silent distance. It was the only way to keep from shattering completely. During the days, a new kind of horror began to dawn, a slow, creeping realization that was in some ways more terrifying than the nightly assaults. It was the bolt. The bolt was always secured after they left. It was a lock on a prison door, and someone on the outside had the key. The faceless men who came in the night were not intruders. They were guests. They were being let in. The thought was a venom that spread through her veins, poisoning everything. She would watch the sliver of daylight, her mind racing. Who? Who was opening the door for them? The answer was so monstrous, so utterly inconceivable, that she fought against it with all her might. But it was there, a dark and undeniable truth, lurking just beneath the surface of her denial. Her father. It had to be him. He was the one who locked her in. He was the one who brought her food. He was her jailer. And now, she understood, he was her procurer. The sermons he delivered through the door took on a new, sickening meaning. The words about cleansing and purification, about tearing the wickedness from her soul, were no longer just the ravings of a zealot. They were a justification, a perverse and twisted rationale for the horrors he was orchestrating. He wasn't punishing her for a kiss. He was using her. He was serving her up to his followers, a sacrifice on the altar of his insane faith. The confirmation of this silent conspiracy came from an unexpected and heartbreaking source: her mother. Sarah Blackwood was a ghost in her own home, a woman of timid gestures and downcast eyes, perpetually lost in her husband's shadow. Amelia had screamed for her, cried for her in the first few days of her confinement, but her cries had gone unanswered. She had resigned herself to her mother's powerlessness. But then, the small tokens began to appear. Sometimes, nestled beside the dry piece of bread on the meal tray, there would be something extra: a bruised pear, a handful of nuts, once a slightly softened piece of gingerbread, its sweet, spicy scent, a ghost of a life she no longer had. These were not offerings of love or defiance. They were gestures of pity. They were the silent, gut-wrenching confessions of a woman who knew exactly what was happening in the cellar and did nothing to stop it. The extra piece of fruit wasn't sustenance. It was an apology, a weak, pathetic admission of guilt from a co-conspirator. Her mother knew. She knew about the men. She knew her husband was letting them in, and all she could offer was a piece of bread. The realization was a final, devastating blow. She was utterly alone. Her father, the architect of her torment; her mother, the silent accomplice; the men of the town, the faceless instruments of her abuse. Her prison wasn't just the cellar. It was Havenwood. The entire town was her cage. The abuse wasn't a secret sin hidden in the darkness. It was a sentence, publicly sanctioned and privately carried out by the community, that was supposed to protect her. The smiling faces she had seen in church, the men who tipped their hats to her father on the street, the pillars of their small, devout community, any one of them could have been the stranger. The line between neighbor and monster had dissolved, and she was trapped on the wrong side of it. The dissociation became her permanent state, the quiet room in her mind, her only true home. Time lost all meaning, marked only by the cycle of meager meals and nightly terrors. The seasons turned outside her stone box, a world away. The sliver of light from the high window grew stronger, then weaker again. The damp chill of the cellar floor became a constant, biting cold that seeped into her very marrow. She had stopped counting the visits from the stranger. They were simply a feature of the night, as inevitable and as faceless as the darkness itself. Her body grew thinner, her spirit worn down to a single stubborn nub of existence. But something was changing. A subtle internal shift that she at first dismissed as another symptom of starvation or madness. A new kind of sickness in the morning, a deep, unfamiliar ache in her back, a profound weariness that sleep could not touch. Then, one day, she knew. The realization didn't come in a sudden flash, but as a slow, dawning certainty, a cold dread that settled in the pit of her stomach and radiated outwards. She was pregnant. The word itself was a profanity in the context of her world. Pregnant. The knowledge hit her with the force of a physical blow, a wave of absolute, soul-crushing horror. This body, which had become a source of pain and shame, a vessel for the sins of others, had betrayed her in the most fundamental way. It had created life from acts of death. She doubled over, a dry, racking sob tearing through her, the sound swallowed by the damp stone walls. It was the ultimate violation, a permanent, living monument to her suffering. A part of them, of the stranger, was now growing inside of her. But then, as the initial wave of revulsion receded, something else rose in its place. It was faint at first, a flicker in the vast darkness of her despair, but it was undeniably there. A primal, animalistic surge of protectiveness. She placed a trembling hand on her still flat stomach. Beneath the layers of horror and shame, there was a life. A tiny, flickering heartbeat that was not hers. This child, conceived in the deepest pit of violation, was the only thing in this world that was truly, unequivocally hers. It did not belong to her father. It did not belong to the strangers. It was a part of her, a seed of her own life force that had taken root against all odds. In that moment, the child became her anchor. It was no longer just a symbol of her abuse. It was her reason to endure it. For this tiny, unborn person, she would survive. She would eat the dry bread. She would drink the brackish water. She would retreat to the quiet room in her mind during the nightly rituals. She would do whatever it took to keep this small flame of life from being extinguished. The horror was still there, a constant, chilling undercurrent, but now it was twinned with a fierce, desperate hope. It was a seed of hope and horror, intertwined and inseparable. Days turned into a week. The knowledge of the pregnancy was a heavy secret, a fragile shield she held around herself. But it was a secret that couldn't be kept forever. Soon, it would become visible. What would her father do then? The thought sent a jolt of pure terror through her. Would he see it as the ultimate proof of her sinfulness? Would he fly into a rage? Would he cast her out to die in the winter cold? Or would he, in his righteous fury, simply descend the stairs and kill her himself? The fear was a living thing, coiling in her gut. But the alternative, letting this child be born into the same darkness, to be discovered and claimed by him, was even more terrifying. She had to know. She had to face him. That afternoon, when she heard his familiar, heavy footsteps approach the cellar door, she forced herself to her feet. She stood directly beneath the door, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. The bolt scraped back. The tray appeared. "Father," she said, her voice a dry, cracking whisper she hardly recognized as her own. The footsteps on the stairs paused. There was a long, expectant silence. "Speak, child." His voice rumbled through the wood. "Confess your sins to the Lord." She took a shaky breath, the cold air burning her lungs. This was it. This was the moment that would decide her fate and the fate of the life inside her. I am with child," she managed to say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the explosion, for the roar of fury, the condemnation, the sound of him storming down the stairs to deliver his final judgment. But all she heard was silence. A deep, profound, and terrifying silence that stretched for an eternity. The air in the cellar grew thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken energy. She could feel his presence on the other side of the door, his mind working, processing her confession. She imagined his face, contorted in rage, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing, and then she heard a sound that froze the very blood in her veins, more chilling than any scream or curse he could have uttered. It was the sound of a slow smile spreading across his face. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it. She could hear it in the shift of his weight, in the soft intake of his breath. She could hear it in the very quality of the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the thunder of a wrathful god. It was soft, reverent, and filled with a terrifying, ecstatic joy. "Praise God," he breathed, the words slithering through the cracks in the door. "A blessing, a true blessing from the Almighty." Amelia stood frozen in the darkness, her blood turned to ice. His reaction was not one of rage or disgust. It was elation. This was not the response of a father discovering his daughter's shame. It was the response of a farmer discovering a prize crop. The horror of her situation, which she thought had reached its absolute peak, had just descended into a new, impossibly deeper level of hell. His joy was the most monstrous thing she had ever encountered. It was the joy of a madman, and she was trapped in the cellar with his dream. For the first time since her imprisonment began, the heavy oak door to the cellar swung fully open, and her father descended the stairs. He did not carry a whip or a weapon. He was not shrouded in the righteous anger she had expected and feared for so long. Instead, his face was illuminated by a kind of beatific glow, an ecstatic light in his eyes that was far more terrifying than any rage. He moved not with the heavy tread of a jailer, but with the light, reverent steps of a priest entering a holy sanctum. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands clasped before him as if in prayer, a wide, beatific smile stretched across his face. The cellar, her tomb of shame and shadow, was suddenly a sacred space in his eyes. "Amelia," he said, his voice trembling with a profound, joyous emotion, "you do not understand the miracle that has been wrought here. You see your condition as a mark of shame, a consequence of sin. But you are wrong. It is a sign. It is a testament to our faith." She stared at him, her mind unable to bridge the chasm between her reality and his. The smell of mildew and damp earth was the same, the biting cold was the same, but the entire meaning of her suffering was being twisted before her very eyes into something monstrous and unrecognizable. He took another step closer, his eyes scanning the dark, filthy space, as if seeing it for the first time. "I have not been entirely truthful with you, my child," he continued, his voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial whisper. "My sermons from the porch, my role as a simple community leader, that is only the surface. That is the face we show the world. Beneath it, there is a deeper truth, a holier purpose." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the frigid air. "We are the chosen of Havenwood," he declared, his voice ringing with pride. "A small, secret congregation of the truly faithful. We have been blessed with a sacred duty. The world outside is corrupt, its bloodlines tainted by weakness and sin. Our purpose, our divine mandate, is to keep our own line pure, to create a community worthy of God's grace." Amelia's blood ran cold. The men, the faceless, nameless strangers. She suddenly saw them in her mind's eye. The deacon from the church, the owner of the general store, the farmer from down the road, the pillars of the community. They weren't just men, they were a congregation. "Your sin," Joseph said, the word now tasting different on his tongue, "that moment of weakness by the creek, it was a test, and in your failure, you became something new. You became an unclean vessel." He said the words not as an insult, but as a statement of profound theological fact. A soul tainted by sin cannot bear a pure child. It is a law of nature and a law of God. The vessel must be cleansed before it can hold something holy. The pieces began to click into place in her mind, forming a picture of such grotesque and systematic depravity that she felt her sanity begin to splinter. "The cleansing," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Yes," he beamed, his eyes shining with zealous fire. "The cleansing. The men who came to you, they were not strangers. They were the brethren, the strongest and most devout among the chosen. They were performing a sacred rite, a ritual of purification. Through their sacrifice, through their willingness to share in your sin, they were cleansing you. They were washing the vessel clean with their own piety, preparing it for a holy purpose." The world tilted on its axis. The abuse, the nightly terror, the facelessness of her violators, it hadn't been punishment. It hadn't even been personal. It was a ceremony, a sacrament. She was not a daughter being disciplined. She was a ritual object being consecrated. "The pregnancy," he said, his voice rising in a crescendo of triumph as he gestured toward her stomach. "This is not a badge of your shame, Amelia. It is the proof. It is the miracle we have been praying for. It is the sign that the ritual was a success. The vessel has been cleansed, and God has blessed it with new life." He looked at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated victory. "That child you carry," he explained, his tone now that of a teacher explaining a simple truth to a slow student. is not truly yours. It was conceived in holiness, through a sacred act of the entire congregation. It belongs to all of us. It will be born pure, untainted by your original sin. It will be raised by the chosen, taught our ways, and prepared for its destiny. It will be our future, our new leader. And there it was, the final, terrible unveiling of the truth. The full, systematic nature of her suffering laid bare. The past months of her life replayed in her mind, each event now cast in a horrifying new light. The kiss by the creek was not a sin to be punished, but an excuse to begin the process. Her imprisonment was not a penance, but a preparation. Her mother's silent pity was not just cowardice, but the complicity of a fellow cult member. The entire town, their smiles and sermons, their shared faith, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide the monstrous engine of their beliefs. She finally understood. Her father's cold disappointment, his sermons on purity, his meticulous control over her life, it was never about saving her soul. It was about controlling her body. This was not about punishment. It had never been about punishment. It was a breeding program. It began not with a scream, but with a dull, coiling cramp low in my belly, a serpent of pain unspooling in the dark. For a moment, I thought it was just another phantom ache, another ghost of sensation in a body I had long since learned to abandon. In the years spent in this stone-walled cage, my mind had become a fortress, and my body was the long-suffering land outside its gates, a territory I rarely visited. But this serpent had teeth. It tightened again, sharp and insistent, a deep, primal clenching that pulled a choked gasp from my lungs. It was real. After all the silent, bloodless horror, after the endless nights of ritualized violation by the men my father called the instruments of purification, the final consequence was arriving. The air in the cellar was thick with the smells of damp earth, mildew, and my own fear. It was a stagnant cocktail I had breathed for so long it had become a part of me. Above me, the floorboards of the house were silent. It was the hour of my father's evening service, a time when he would gather the faithful on our wide porch, his voice a hypnotic baritone rolling over the heads of his flock, speaking of purity and sacrifice. He was up there now, in the crisp Vermont air, a pillar of righteous conviction, while I, the secret source of his divine theater, was trapped below, my body beginning the agonizing work of expelling the proof of his monstrous doctrine. Another wave of pain crashed over me, more powerful this time. It stole my breath, forcing my back to arch against the packed dirt floor. I bit down on my lip, the coppery taste of blood a familiar communion. I could not scream. A scream would bring discovery, but not the kind that led to salvation. It would bring my father, his face a mask of cold disappointment, or worse, holy fervor. He would see this not as a birth, but as the final, messy stage of a sacred experiment. The child, his blessed child, was coming, and I was merely the vessel, the defiled crucible from which a pure soul was to be extracted. I pressed my hands against my swollen belly, feeling the impossible hardness beneath my palms. A frantic, desperate love, born of pure terror, surged through me. This child, this tiny, innocent being conceived in the most profound darkness, was the only thing that was truly mine. He was not a symbol. He was not a testament to their twisted faith. He was a person, a life, and my father and his chosen would not have him. They saw him as their future leader, a holy relic to be polished and displayed. I saw him as my only reason to survive the next hour. The iron bolt on the cellar door slid back with a grating screech that tore through the quiet agony of the room. My heart seized. It was too soon. The service wasn't over. It had to be him. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the sight of my father's silhouette blotting out the dim light from the hallway. But the footsteps on the stone steps were lighter, hesitant. They were not the confident, heavy tread of Joseph Blackwood. A figure emerged from the shadows, carrying a flickering oil lamp that cast long, dancing ghouls on the walls. It was my mother. Sarah Blackwood was a woman whittled down by silence. Her face, once soft, was now a collection of fine, brittle lines, a roadmap of unspoken grief. She moved with a permanent stoop, as if carrying an invisible weight, the weight of complicity. For years, she had been the one to bring me my meager meals, her eyes always fixed on the floor, her hands trembling as she passed the tray through the slot in the door. We existed in a shared prison, hers made of fear, mine of stone and iron. She set the lamp on a crate, the warm light pushing back the worst of the gloom. She looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She saw me writhing on the thin, straw-filled mattress, my face pale and slick with sweat. And in her eyes, I saw the ice of her long-held composure finally begin to crack. "It's time," I whispered, the words ragged. She knelt beside me without a word, her movements clumsy, uncertain. She took a cloth from the bucket of water she'd brought and gently dabbed my forehead. Her touch was a shock, a forgotten language. It was the touch of a mother, and it was so foreign, so painfully overdue, that it almost broke me. "He is at the service," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "He speaks of the grace that will be born tonight." The grace. A bitter laugh caught in my throat. Another contraction ripped through me, and this time I couldn't stop the low moan that escaped my lips. My mother flinched, her hand tightening on the cloth. "You must be quiet, Amelia," she urged, her fear palpable. "They will hear." "Let them," I panted, a wild, reckless anger flaring through the pain. "Let the whole town hear what he's done." Her face crumpled. "Don't say that. You don't understand." "I understand everything," I snarled, pushing myself up on my elbows. "I understand that he let those men. I understand that he calls this a blessing." The pain subsided for a moment, leaving me shaking in its wake. In that fragile quiet, my mother's silence, the silence she had maintained for years, finally shattered. It broke, not in a flood, but in a choked, painful trickle. "He took my first," she whispered, her gaze lost in the flickering shadows on the stone wall. "Before you, I had a daughter." I stared at her, the story of my own agony momentarily forgotten. I never knew. I had always been, to my knowledge, an only child. "Her name was Clara," Sarah continued, her voice trembling, so quiet I had to strain to hear. "She was perfect, but she was a girl. Your father, he wanted a son to carry on his work, to be a true heir to his vision. He prayed for a son." She took a shuddering breath. "She was born small, healthy," the midwife said, "but small. Joseph took her from me one night. He told me she was sickly, that God had called her home before the world could stain her. He said it was a mercy." Another contraction seized me, and I cried out, digging my fingers into the damp earth. My mother's hand found mine, her grip surprisingly strong. Her own long-buried pain seemed to be giving her a strength I had never seen. "I heard her cry," she said, tears finally tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "From the barn. Just once. And then silence. He came back near dawn and told me she was buried, that her soul was with the angels. But I know, Amelia, in my heart, I know he killed her. He smothered the life from her because she wasn't the son he demanded from God." The confession hung in the air, a horror so immense it dwarfed even the monstrous reality of my own situation. It recontextualized everything I knew about my family, about this house, the oppressive piety, the cold silences, my father's obsession with a male heir. It was all rooted in an infant's unmarked grave. My mother's paralysis, her years of silent, fearful obedience, was the penance of a woman who believed she had failed to protect her child and had been living in the shadow of her husband's deadliest sin ever since. "He wants a son," she repeated, her eyes now burning with a feverish light, the light of a decision made after decades of indecision. "He believes this child, your child, is his divine reward, a pure leader born from your cleansed vessel." She looked at me, her gaze clear and sharp. The frightened, subservient woman was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. "He will not take your son," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a raw, fierce statement of fact. While the next wave of pain crested, she moved with sudden purpose. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out two things. The first was a small, heavy iron key, dark with age. The second was a small, folded bundle of cash, worn and soft. She pressed them into my free hand, her fingers cold and trembling. "This is the key to the cellar door," she said, her words coming in a rush. "It is the only other one. He thinks I lost it years ago. The money. It is not much. I have saved it for a long time. For what? I never knew. Until now." I stared at the key in my palm. It felt impossibly heavy, a dense nugget of hope. It was a miracle. "He is leading a final prayer," my mother urged, her eyes darting toward the ceiling, as if she could hear his voice through the stone and wood. "It will last some time yet. When the child is born, you must go." "You cannot hesitate, Amelia. You cannot wait." "Where?" I gasped, my mind reeling. "Where can I go?" "Away from here. Anywhere but Havenwood. The whole town. They follow him. They believe in him. There is no one here who will help you." She gripped my hand tighter. "Run. Run and never look back. Do it for Clara. Do it so my grandson can live." The word grandson struck a chord deep inside her. It was an acknowledgement, a claim. This child was not just my son. He was her blood, her chance at redemption. The hours that followed were a blur of fire and blood, of my mother's whispered encouragements, and the raw, guttural sounds of my own body tearing itself apart to bring forth new life. In that foul, hallowed darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of my past and the specter of my father's fanaticism, I gave birth. As the first, weak cry of my son echoed off the stone walls, a sound of pure, untainted life in a place of profound death, I knew my mother was right. There was no choice. She cleaned him as best she could, her hands shaking but steady, and wrapped him in a clean woolen blanket she'd smuggled down. She placed him in my arms. He was so small, so impossibly fragile. His face was red and wrinkled, his eyes squeezed shut against the harsh reality of the world he'd entered. I looked at his perfect, tiny form, and the plan solidified in my mind, no longer a desperate hope, but a burning necessity. I would not let my father's shadow fall across this child. I would carry him into the light, or I would die trying. "His name is Elijah," I whispered, the name coming to me as if delivered by a will stronger than my own. A prophet's name, a name of strength and defiance. My mother kissed my forehead, her tears falling on my cheek. "Go now," she breathed. "He will not take Elijah." Weak, bleeding, and trembling from exhaustion and exertion, I got to my feet. I clutched my son to my chest, his warmth a small sun against my skin. With my other hand, I held the iron key. At the top of the stairs, I slid it into the lock. It turned with a well-oiled click. The sound of freedom. I pushed the door open and stepped out of my tomb and into the sleeping house, the Vermont winter howling softly outside the windows. The house was a museum of my family's silent decay. The air upstairs was different, still oppressive, but layered with the scent of lemon polish and dried flowers, a futile attempt to mask the rot at its core. Every creak of the floorboards under my bare feet was a thunderclap in the stillness. I could hear them, the low, rhythmic murmur of my father's flock on the porch, their voices rising and falling in prayer. They were praying for the holy child, unaware that his mother was stealing him away from them. Clutching Elijah, who was now sleeping against my chest, I slipped through the kitchen and out the back door. The cold was a physical blow. It sliced through my thin cotton dress, shocking the breath from my lungs and raising goosebumps on my skin. The world was a canvas of white and black, moonlight on fresh-fallen snow, the dark skeletons of the maple trees clawing at the star-dusted sky. For a moment, the sheer, open space was dizzying after years in confinement. My first instinct was to run for the woods, to disappear into the ancient, whispering darkness of the Green Mountains. But my mother's words echoed in my mind. The whole town, they follow him. The woods were his territory, too. They held their prayer meetings there, their cleansing rituals in hidden groves. To flee into the trees was to flee into another, larger cage. No, I needed something else. A place of reason. A place of science. A place that stood in direct opposition to everything my father represented. There was only one such place in Havenwood, the town clinic. It was a small, modern building on the edge of the main street, a sterile outpost of logic in a town drowning in fanatical faith. It was run by a new doctor, a young man from the city who, I'd heard in whispers before my imprisonment, the townsfolk regarded with a mixture of necessity and suspicion. He was an outsider, and right now, an outsider was my only hope. The journey was a nightmare. My body was a wreck, torn and bleeding, protesting every step. The snow soaked through my thin slippers, numbing my feet. But the weight of Elijah in my arms was an anchor and a propellant. His life depended on me. I stumbled through backyards and cut across sleeping fields, keeping to the shadows, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The clinic's lights were a distant, hopeful beacon. I don't know how long it took. Time had become a fluid, meaningless concept. But finally, I was there, standing before the glass door of the Havenwood Community Clinic. A light was on in a back office. He was working late. With the last of my strength, I pushed the door open. The chime above it was deafeningly loud. A man appeared from the back room, wiping his hands on a towel. He was young, as I'd heard, with kind, tired eyes and a face that hadn't yet learned the harsh, guarded expressions of the Havenwood locals. He wore blue scrubs, and his brow furrowed in concern when he saw me. "Ma'am, can I help you? We're closed, but—" He stopped, his eyes taking in my state. The blood on my dress, the newborn clutched in my arms, the wild terror in my eyes. His professionalism kicked in instantly. "My God, come in, sit down. What happened?" He was Dr. David Miller. He led me to an examination room, his voice calm and reassuring, a stark contrast to the booming, condemnatory tones I was used to. He helped me onto the padded table and immediately began checking on Elijah, his hands gentle and sure. "He's cold, but he's breathing well," he murmured, wrapping Elijah in a fresh, warm blanket from a warmer. "And you've just given birth. You need medical attention." I opened my mouth to try and explain, to somehow put words to the years of horror, to the systematic madness that had led me to his door. But before I could form a single coherent sentence, a shadow fell across the glass front door. Then another, and another. I looked up, my blood running cold. Through the window of the exam room, I could see the clinic's entrance. It was filling with silent, grim-faced men. They weren't shouting. They were just standing there, their forms dark and menacing against the snow-lit street, their presence a suffocating wave of silent threat. I recognized their faces from my childhood, from the pews of my father's makeshift church. These were the deacons, the elders, the chosen. At the front of the pack stood a man in a sheriff's uniform. Sheriff Brody. A key member of my father's inner circle, a man whose duty was to uphold the law, but whose true allegiance was to the cult. He raised a hand and knocked on the glass, a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Doctor." Miller looked from me to the crowd at the door, his expression shifting from medical concern to utter disbelief and dawning horror. Sheriff Brody's voice cut through the glass, low and authoritative. "Dr. Miller, open the door." "What is this?" David whispered, looking back at me. "What do they want?" I clutched Elijah tighter, the sterile safety of the clinic evaporating into a new kind of trap. "They want my son," I choked out, the words tasting like ash. "They call him the community's child." Sheriff Brody's voice came again, louder this time, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Hand over the child, doctor. He belongs to Havenwood." The doctor, David, was a man of science, a creature of logic and evidence. He stared at the mob outside, at the town's chief law enforcement officer leading them, and I could see the gears in his mind grinding to a halt against a wall of pure, unadulterated madness. This was beyond anything his medical training or city upbringing could have prepared him for. He looked at me, a bleeding, traumatized woman. He looked at the tiny, vulnerable infant in his care, and he looked at the cold, righteous certainty in the eyes of the men outside. In that moment, he made a choice. He chose sanity. He chose his oath. "Stay here," he said, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to control. He walked to the front of the clinic and flipped the deadbolt on the glass door. The solid thunk of the lock was a small act of defiance in the face of the encroaching insanity. "Sheriff Brody," David called out, his voice impressively steady. "This is a medical facility. This woman and her child are my patients. They are under my care. You have no right to be here." Sheriff Brody's face, visible under the harsh glow of the clinic's porch light, was a granite mask of conviction. "That child is a blessing, Doctor. He was promised to us. He belongs to this community. He does not belong to her." He spat the last word with a venom that made me flinch. "She is an unclean vessel. Now open this door before we are forced to open it for you." David stood his ground, a lone figure in blue scrubs against a wall of dark winter coats and darker intentions. "You are not coming in here. If you have a problem, you can take it up with the state board, but you will not harass my patients." The standoff was brief. A low murmur rippled through the men. Then, one of them, a burly farmer named Silas, whose face I remembered from the periphery of my nightmares, stepped forward and slammed the flat of his hand against the glass. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence. Then another man joined him, and another. A slow, rhythmic pounding began, the glass shuddering in its frame. They weren't trying to talk anymore. They were coming in. David rushed back to me, his face pale. "The back door," he said, his mind racing. "It leads to the alley. My car is there." But as he spoke, two more figures appeared at the clinic's rear window, their faces pressed against the glass like hungry ghosts. They had anticipated it. We were surrounded. The clinic, my island of reason, had become a fishbowl, and the sharks were circling, their patience wearing thin. The pounding on the front door grew louder, more frantic. Spiderweb cracks began to appear in the safety glass. I was trapped. Again. After the escape, after the hope, it was all ending here, in this sterile white room. They would break through the glass, they would swarm in, and they would tear Elijah from my arms. They would take him back to my father's house, and I would be dragged back to the cellar, my punishment for this defiance unimaginable. Despair washed over me, cold and absolute. I clutched my son to my chest, my body curling around him instinctively, a pathetic final attempt to shield him from the inevitable. And then, through the fog of terror, an idea sparked. It was born of desperation, a wild, insane gamble, but it was the only weapon I had left. For years, I had been a silent victim of their faith. I had listened to my father preach from the top of the cellar stairs, his words about sin, purification, and anonymity seeping through the cracks in the door. I knew the architecture of their beliefs. I knew its strengths, the unwavering unity, the shared purpose. And in that moment, I realized I also knew its greatest weakness. The secret, individual sins that their collective righteousness was designed to hide. They performed their duty in the anonymous dark of my cellar, each man an interchangeable instrument of God's will, their identities shielded from me, and more importantly, from each other. The glass of the front door groaned, a long, screeching sound of protest, before a large section of it shattered, falling to the linoleum floor with a crash. The men surged forward, their hands reaching through the broken opening to fumble with the lock. We had seconds. "No!" I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and powerful. I scrambled off the examination table, ignoring the searing pain in my body. With Elijah held tight against my shoulder, I stumbled toward the front of the clinic, toward the broken door and the sea of faces. David tried to hold me back. "Amelia, don't!" But I shook him off. I stopped just out of their reach, my eyes scanning the crowd until I found him. My father. Joseph Blackwood stood just behind Sheriff Brody, his face alight with a terrible, triumphant fire. He saw his prophecy coming true. He saw his holy child coming into his possession. I locked eyes with him. I held his gaze, channeling every ounce of my pain, my rage, and my stolen years into that single look. Then I raised my voice so that every man there, every single one of my faceless violators could hear me. "You want this child, Joseph?" I shrieked, my voice cracking with the strain. The men at the door froze, their hands paused on the lock. Every eye turned to me. The pounding stopped. The only sound was the whistling of the wind through the broken glass. "You want him so badly?" I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Then tell them. Tell all of these faithful men the truth. Tell them which one of you is his father." A dead, profound silence fell over the crowd. The accusation, flung into their midst like a lit torch, hung in the frigid air. I wasn't done. I swept my gaze over the faces of the men. Silas the farmer, Mr. Gable the store owner, even Sheriff Brody himself, whose face had gone slack with shock. "Was it you, Sheriff? Did you perform your holy duty that night in March? Or was it you, Silas? Do you think he has your eyes? Or maybe—" I turned my eyes back to my father, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. "He has no father among them at all. Is he yours, Joseph? Is this perfect, holy child the product of your own sin?" It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The accusation was a poisoned dart, striking the one thing that held their monstrous union together: their anonymity. In the cellar, they were a collective. Here, in the light, with my words echoing in their ears, they were individuals. They were men with wives, with children, with reputations. Men who had been assured their participation was a secret, sacred act. I saw it happen. The shift was instantaneous. The unified front of righteous men dissolved into a collection of suspicious, paranoid individuals. Eyes darted from one man to another. Who had she been with? When? Was she lying? Or was she telling a truth so terrible it could bring their whole world crashing down? The rock-solid certainty in their faces was replaced by the furtive, twitching suspicion of guilty men wondering who else knew their secret. A low, angry murmur started at the back of the crowd. Someone shoved someone else. Their unity was not just broken, it was shattered. In that single, perfect moment of chaos and confusion, as my father stood speechless and his flock began to turn on itself, David seized the opportunity. "Now," he hissed, grabbing my arm. He didn't lead me to the compromised back door. He pulled me toward a side office, one whose window looked out onto a narrow, snow-choked alleyway on the side of the building they hadn't thought to cover. He threw the window open. "Go." "I'll be right behind you." He helped me clamber through, the cold air and rough sill scraping my raw skin. I landed in a snowdrift, the soft powder cushioning my fall. I held Elijah up, protecting his head, my heart hammering against my ribs. A second later, David was through the window beside me. "My car is just at the end of the alley," he said, pulling me to my feet. We ran. We slipped and slid down the narrow passage, the sounds of angry, confused shouting from the front of the clinic fading behind us. We reached the street and piled into his old, beat-up sedan. The engine turned over with a reassuring roar. David didn't even bother with the headlights. He slammed the car into gear and we sped away, tires spinning on the icy road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the clinic, a small box of light with a cluster of dark, arguing figures in front of it. Then they were gone. We raced out of Havenwood, past the sleeping houses and the tall, silent steeple of my father's church. We drove into the vast, dark unknown of the Vermont night, leaving the town and the ghosts I had lived with for so long to fester and rot in their own poisoned faith. I looked down at the sleeping face of my son, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He was safe. I was free. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was not an end. It was the beginning of a different kind of war. My father had wanted to cleanse my soul. Instead, he had forged it into a weapon. And one day, I would return to reap the harvest he had sown. The city was a symphony of indifference, and I had learned to love its music. The screech of subway brakes, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of 1,000 conversations I would never be a part of. They were the sounds of anonymity, the hymn of the unseen. It was a freedom more profound than any sermon on salvation I had ever heard on my father's porch. David had found us a small, third-floor walk-up in a burrow that never slept. It smelled of fried onions and exhaust fumes, a world away from the cloying scent of pine and damp earth that had defined my existence. He had given me a new name, Amelia Gable, plain and forgettable. He had also given me a lifeline, a few $1,000s, carefully saved, and a promise to remain a ghost in my life, a voice on the phone, a guardian angel from a past I had to bury. The first years were a blur of exhaustion and fierce, animalistic love. I took jobs that left my hands raw and my back aching. I scrubbed floors in office buildings after midnight, the scent of chemical polish a strange and welcome purification. I served coffee in a diner where the clatter of plates and the drone of the jukebox were a shield against the silence that still threatened to swallow me whole. In Havenwood, silence had been a weapon, a prelude to judgment. Here, it was simply an absence of noise, and I filled it with the sound of my son's breathing, Elijah, my beautiful, impossible boy. He was born of horror, a seed of hope planted in the most desecrated ground, and yet he was perfect. He had my eyes, but they held none of my fear. He had a laugh that could shatter the shadows that clung to the corners of our tiny apartment. Raising him became my life's true ritual, the only one that mattered. Every meal I cooked, every story I read him, every time I held his small hand as we crossed the street, I was actively defying my father. Joseph had intended for my son to be an icon for his twisted faith, a symbol of their cleansing. Instead, he was my symbol of survival. He was the living, breathing proof that I had won. Protecting him from the truth of his conception was the most difficult vow I ever made. The questions began when he was small, innocent inquiries that felt like daggers to my heart. "Mama, where's my daddy?" he asked one evening, his head resting on my lap as I braided his hair, a simple, domestic act that felt like a miracle. My throat closed. The faces of the strangers flickered behind my eyes, a gallery of faceless monsters. I had to invent a man for him, a hero worthy of my son's love. "Your father," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my soul, "was a very brave man, Eli. He was a traveler, a man who saw the world and wanted to make it better. He had to go on a long journey, a very important one, far away. But he loved you more than anything. It was a flimsy shield, a story woven from pain and necessity. But for a child it was enough. It gave him an anchor, a noble ghost to look up to instead of the horrifying void that was the truth. David was my confessor, my only link to the woman I had been. Our calls were infrequent but essential. He never pushed, never pried. He would ask, "How is the young man?" and, "Are you managing, Amelia?" And I would tell him about Elijah's first day of school, about a promotion at the diner, about the small victories that constituted our new life. He was a doctor, and his quiet clinical calm was a balm to my frayed nerves. He was the only person on earth who knew the full story, the only one who had seen me at my most broken. His unwavering platonic friendship was a testament to a goodness I had once believed didn't exist in the world. He was the antithesis of my father, a man who healed without judgment, who helped without demanding worship. As Elijah grew, I instilled in him not a fear of faith, but a deep, abiding wariness of dogma. When we passed street preachers shouting about damnation, I wouldn't pull him away in fear. I would stop and listen for a moment, and later, I would ask him, "What do you think, Eli? Do you think God needs a man to shout for him? Or do you think he is found in quieter places?" I taught him to question, to think critically, to trust his own conscience above any book or any charismatic leader. "Belief is a beautiful, powerful thing," I told him. "But it should be a house you build for yourself, not a cage someone else locks you in." He didn't understand the depth of the warning, but he understood the principle. He grew into a thoughtful, compassionate boy, skeptical but not cynical, with an abhorrence for bullies and a deep empathy for the underdog. He was everything they were not. While Elijah slept, a different part of me awakened. The part that had been forged in the cellar, the part that had learned to dissociate, had now learned to focus. I went to the public library, a cathedral of knowledge I had been denied my whole life. I started with the basics, devouring books on economics, business management, and corporate law. The language was foreign, complex, but I attacked it with the desperation of a starving woman. The librarians saw a tired single mother trying to better herself. They didn't see the vengeful strategist meticulously gathering her arsenal. I started a ledger, a simple spiral notebook. On the first page I wrote, Joseph Blackwood, then Sheriff Brody. Then, one by one, I added the names of the other men, the pillars of the community who had been my strangers. Over the years, through quiet, patient research, old newspaper archives, public records, the occasional discreet inquiry made by a private investigator paid for with money I had painstakingly saved, I built a profile of my prison. I learned about their businesses, their farms, their mortgages, their children. I mapped out the entire economic and social ecosystem of Havenwood. I learned who owed money to whom, which families held the most influence, and where the cracks in their self-righteous facade were beginning to show. And the city provided the perfect cover. I started investing, small amounts at first, guided by the principles I was learning. My first success was a modest one, a well-timed investment in a tech startup that tripled my initial stake. The feeling was intoxicating. It wasn't the money itself, but what it represented. Power. Not the brute, domineering power of my father, but a silent, invisible force that could move mountains from 1,000 miles away. I wasn't building wealth for comfort. I was forging a sword. Years turned into a decade, then two. Elijah graduated from high school at the top of his class and was accepted into a prestigious pre-med program. The day we read his acceptance letter, I wept with a joy so pure it felt like it could wash away all the grime of the past. He wanted to be a healer. He wanted to spend his life mending what was broken. The beautiful, perfect irony of it was my private victory. I was a quiet, respectable woman, living in a comfortable brownstone now. My menial jobs were long behind me. I managed my portfolio from a small home office, my ledger now a sophisticated, encrypted file on a secure computer. I was Amelia Gable, a woman with no past, but in that office, in the dead of night, I was still the girl in the cellar, and I was sharpening my blade. The news of my father's death came not with a bang, but with a quiet email from David. He had attached a link to an obituary in the Havenwood Chronicle. Joseph Blackwood, 78, had passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his loving community. The article lauded him as the town's spiritual guide, a man of unwavering faith and moral clarity. It spoke of his legacy, the chosen of Havenwood, now led by Sheriff Brody's son, a man who possessed all of his father's cruelty, but none of his charisma. I read the words without emotion. There was no surge of triumph, no cathartic release. His death was not an endpoint. It was a starting pistol. He had escaped my direct justice, but his legacy, the town that was a living monument to his evil, was still there. It was a cancer, and I was the surgeon. I opened my encrypted file. The names and businesses glowed on the screen, a web of interconnected sin and hypocrisy. The time for learning was over. The harvest was about to begin. My revenge was never going to be swift or violent. That was their way. Mine would be a slow, creeping poison, a systemic rot that would devour them from the inside out, using the very structures they had built to protect themselves. My first move was spiritual. They had built their power on a foundation of absolute religious authority. So, I would give them a rival god. Through a series of anonymous donations channeled through a philanthropic foundation I controlled, I funded the establishment of a new church on the outskirts of Havenwood. I chose the pastor myself after a long search. He was a young, charismatic man with a message of forgiveness, inclusivity, and modern grace. Everything Joseph Blackwood's cult was not. The New Light Community Church offered daycare, youth groups with popular music, and sermons that spoke of God's love, not his wrath. It was an irresistible alternative to the grim, demanding piety of the chosen. At first, the cultists scoffed, But then, a few of the younger families, tired of the old ways and the constant pressure, began attending the New Lights Sunday picnics. Their children preferred the modern songs to the dreary ancient hymns. A schism, small at first, began to form. I read the reports from my investigator with a surgeon's detachment. The first public argument between a chosen elder and his son, who wanted to have his baby baptized at the new church. The declining attendance at the old meeting house. The foundation of their power was cracking. Next, I turned to their finances. This was the masterstroke, the culmination of 2 decades of study. Havenwood's economy was a closed loop. The farms, the logging operations, the general store, they were all owned by cult members and their families, their debts held by the local bank, which was, of course, controlled by men loyal to the chosen. They were insulated, or so they thought. Over a period of 18 months, using a network of shell corporations with adyne names like Northern Ridge Holdings and Green Valley Acquisitions, I began to buy their debt. My corporations approached the regional banks that held the master loans for the Havenwood Savings Loan. We offered a premium, and in a tough economy, the banks were happy to offload the risk. Piece by piece, I became their silent, invisible creditor. They owed their livelihoods, their homes, their ancestral farms, not to their neighbors, but to me. I waited until the autumn, just after their harvest. It was a symbolic choice. They had reaped their crops, believing in their prosperity. Then, I reaped my own. On a single Monday morning, the letters went out. Not from a vengeful woman, but from the sterile legal departments of my corporations. The language was cold, impersonal, and absolute. Pursuant to Section 4A of your loan agreement, we are exercising our right to call the note. Full payment is due within 30 days. Panic was a contagion. It ripped through Havenwood faster than any fever. The men who had stood so tall, so sure of their divine protection, were suddenly faced with the stark, unforgiving reality of a balance sheet. They ran to the local bank, only to find that the bank itself was beholden to the same invisible power. They held a town meeting in the old hall, the same hall where they had once planned their rituals. But instead of unity, there was only accusation and fear. Men who had called each other brother now looked at each other with suspicion, each wondering if the other's financial ruin would drag them down too. The wave of bankruptcies was not a wave, it was a tsunami. Farms that had been in families for generations went into foreclosure. Businesses that were the lifeblood of the town shuttered their windows. The economic foundation of the chosen crumbled to dust. But I wasn't finished. I had broken their faith and their finances. Now I would break their families. This was the most delicate, most cruel part of my plan. I had collected stories for years, whispers, rumors, and the fragmented truths my mother had confessed in her moment of desperate courage. I didn't have depositions or hard evidence, but I didn't need them. I had half-truths, which are often more poisonous. I began sending anonymous letters. They were typed on plain paper, mailed from different cities across the country, impossible to trace. Each one was a carefully crafted sliver of doubt. To the daughter of a prominent elder, ask your mother why she stopped speaking to her sister after the summer of '92. Was it a family quarrel, or was it her turn for the purification ritual in your father's barn? To the grandson of the former sheriff, your grandfather was a man of the law. Did you know his law required young women to confess their sins to the elders in private? Your own aunt was only 17 when she was cleansed. I was weaponizing their history, turning their secrets against them. The letters didn't make grand accusations. They just asked questions, planting seeds of horror in the minds of a generation that had been raised in ignorance of the cult's true nature. Children began to look at their parents with a dawning, sickening understanding. Quiet, respectable mothers were suddenly seen as collaborators or victims. Stern, pious fathers were revealed as something monstrous. The carefully constructed facade of family and community, the very thing my father had preached from his porch, was torn apart by the questions I had whispered from afar. The town's social fabric, already frayed, disintegrated completely. Havenwood began to eat itself alive. I had poisoned the well, and now they were all drinking from it, their thirst for answers only leading to more pain. From my quiet office, I watched the town I had escaped die a slow, deserved death, cleansed not by fire and brimstone, but by the quiet, methodical application of the truth. The final journey was a pilgrimage in reverse, a return not to a holy place, but to a desecrated one. I was 80 years old. The anger had long since cooled into a kind of geological stillness within me, a vast, quiet plain where a volcano once stood. Elijah, my Elijah, was now a celebrated cardiothoracic surgeon, a man who literally held hearts in his hands and mended them. He had a family of his own, 2 bright children who knew me only as their loving, slightly eccentric Nana, who had a knack for the stock market. He knew nothing of Havenwood. To him, it was just a name on a map of a state I had no reason to ever visit. I drove myself. The car was a new and comfortable sedan, a world away from the rattling bus that had carried me away all those lifetimes ago. As I crossed the Vermont state line, the landscape began to feel unnervously familiar. The fierce green of the mountains, the particular slant of the autumn light through the birch trees. It was a beauty that had once been the backdrop to my ugliest fears. But the fear was gone. I was simply an observer now, a historian returning to the site of an ancient, private war. The sign for Havenwood was still there, though the paint was peeling and one of the posts sagged wearily. Welcome to Havenwood, a community of faith. The irony was so profound it was almost mundane. The town that unfolded beyond the sign was a ghost of my memory. It wasn't just quiet, it was hollowed out. The storefronts on Main Street were mostly boarded up, their windows dusty and blind. The few that remained open, a liquor store, a pawn shop, had iron bars over their doors. The pristine white fences, I remembered, were now gray and splintered. The town's manicured perfection had given way to a deep, settled poverty. It was the physical manifestation of a spiritual rot. The people I saw on the sidewalks walked with their heads down, their faces etched with a suspicion that had become generational. This was the legacy of my revenge, a community that had lost its faith, its wealth, and finally, its trust in itself. It was not a sight that brought me joy, only a grim, quiet sense of completion. A tumor had been excised. The wound left behind was ugly, but the sickness was gone. I didn't need a map to find the farmhouse. The road was more of a suggestion now, 2 ruts of packed dirt overgrown with weeds. I turned onto the lane, and there it was, or what was left of it. The house sagged in the middle, its spine broken. The porch where my father had delivered his sermons had collapsed into a pile of rotting lumber. The windows were empty sockets, gaping at the world. It was a skull. I parked the car and walked toward it, the crunch of my sensible shoes on the gravel the only sound. The front door hung from a single hinge, a silent, agape mouth. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of damp plaster and memories turning to mold. Sunbeams, heavy with dust, cut through the gloom, illuminating the ruin. A patch of faded floral wallpaper in the living room marked where a family portrait had once hung, a portrait of a lie, of a perfect family that never was. I walked through the decaying rooms, my hand brushing against the dust-covered mantelpiece. I was not a ghost here. I was the only living thing. Then I saw it, the doorway to the kitchen, and beyond it, the door to the cellar. Except the door was gone, ripped from its hinges years ago, probably for firewood. All that remained was a dark, rectangular hole in the floor, an open wound leading down into the earth. I walked to the edge and stood at the top of the stone stairs, looking down into the darkness. The same darkness that had swallowed my youth. I could smell it. The cold, damp stone, the faint, metallic scent of fear. I stood there for a long time, not as a victim, but as a victor. There was no terror, no shuddering recollection. The fear had been burned out of me decades ago, cauterized by purpose and time. I looked into that black square, and I saw not a prison, but a crucible. It was the place where the weak, terrified girl had died, and where a mother, forged in iron and silence, had been born. It was the womb from which my son had emerged, and the tomb where my father's world had begun its long, slow death. A voice, my own, echoed in the theater of my mind, the final lines of the story I had been telling myself my entire life. He wanted to cleanse my soul. I narrated to the ghosts of the house, my voice a quiet whisper in the dusty air. Instead, I had to cleanse his town. The weight of it all, the decades of planning, the cold, methodical dismantling of an entire community, settled not as a burden, but as a final, profound stillness. My victory wasn't this wasteland. It wasn't the broken homes and broken lives of my tormentors' children. They were merely the byproduct, the necessary debris of the demolition. My son, Elijah, I said to the darkness, is a doctor, a healer. He spends his days restarting hearts that have stopped. He brings new life into this world and saves the ones that are fading. He is a man of science and compassion, a man who builds, who mends, who loves. A faint, real smile touched my lips. That is my victory. I turned away from the cellar, from the house, from the whole rotten core of my past. I did not look back. I walked to my car, got in, and started the engine. As I drove away, the decaying farmhouse shrank in the rearview mirror, a bad memory receding into the landscape. I left the ghosts of Havenwood to their ruin, to rot with the town they had built. The road ahead was bright and clear, leading back to a life I had made, to a family I had raised in the light. I had closed the book. The story was over, and I was free.